applause for Colin. Now just hold on here, just a minute. Welcome everyone. What a terrific, terrific turnout for our celebration end of Community Read event. When we started planning this 7 months ago, when there was 9 feet of snow outside, you all remember that, right? We could not have anticipated how great this would turn out for us, and hopefully for you. So I have a few thank yous to make tonight, and then you'll get to hear the reason we're all here tonight. First of all, I want to thank our sponsors, Drum & Drum Real Estate, HM Payson, and AGA Korea and Son Jewelry. One of the lucky few that got to go on the Hardy Boat cruise a week ago. You might remember the 8-foot seas. I remember the good times. I want to thank Al and Stacy Crescetti, who donated that cruise to us. The reason why we could do a community read of this far-reaching in our community is because the staff of the library is incredible. And I just want to mention 3 people tonight. Our co-chairs of all of the events that were done this summer, and there were 17 of them, are Amy McNaughton and Jeannie Davis. And an often unsung hero who keeps everything in order, Terry Havoc. One final thank you, and that's to Andrew Fenneman and Lincoln Theater and Gary Hawks for loaning us this beautiful, beautiful space and making everything work for us tonight. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Colin Woodard, author of The Lobster Coast.
Very much. Thank you all for coming. Now that I'm up here, I actually can't see any of you. But thank you again. I'm here to talk about The Lobster Coast, which, as many of you already know, is a story about the past, present, and future of coastal Maine. I call this talk sort of 400 years in 40 minutes. Many of you, I've heard rumor, have read the book, but I'm going to give you the performance art version, and we can open up to questions, and we can talk about just about anything about the book and the topics and whatever you'd like tonight. So thank you again for coming. Now, The Lobster Coast is about Maine's character and its uniqueness, and I guess I came to write it because I grew up in Maine, and I started discovering when I was starting to live in other places in other parts of the country, and you'd be somewhere, and so people find out that you're from Maine, and they go, "Oh, Maine. We love Maine. Maine's so special. It's such an unusual place. We just love Maine." And you hear that a lot, as you're growing up. It's a special, unusual place, and it's got something that other places don't, but no one ever really specifies what it is. What is it about our character that's unique? If it is unique, what are its characteristics, and where did they come from? And it's those questions that got me interested in writing the book, because where did all that come from, and what made us unusual, and in exactly what way are we unusual, and what does that tell us about ourselves? And that ended up being an exercise in researching and exploring colonial American history. I was a history major in college, but I was East European and Balkan history, so this was sort of a new exploration for me. But what I quickly discovered, and have certainly discovered since in the books and the research I did subsequently, is that yeah, Maine was distinct in the beginning, but so were all the colonies in the beginning. I mean, the distinctions between, say, Anglican, Royalist Virginia and Catholic Maryland were so profound on each side of the Chesapeake that they actually, fought wars with one another at different points. There's a point where Virginia ends up marching into Maryland and invading it, and deposing the Lord Baltimore and the Calverts. The Calverts' coat of arms is still on the Maryland flag and license plate today, but they were deposed by the Virginians. There was that kind of intense battle because of the distinctions between those two places. There was New York and New England, the distinctions between those two, because New York was founded by the Dutch, not the English, in the 1640s and 1650s, and was quite a different place from New England itself. And you had this society that was created at a time when the Netherlands was the most sophisticated society in the Western world. This is during the golden age of Amsterdam. And Amsterdam was this center of banking and finance and tolerance and publishing and a refuge for all of the oppressed peoples from the monarchies of Europe. And this little settlement, this little village that they placed at the end of Manhattan Island in the mouth of the Hudson, from the time it was a village of 500 or 600, had all those characteristics. It was multi-ethnic and multicultural and commercial and materialistic and not that much dwelling on great moral questions, and the Puritan mysticism was not happening there. And very sophisticated place. And they looked on the other side of the Hudson River at all the settlements, these English settlements, and what had become known as New England, and they seemed rather the country bumpkins. They referred to them, in fact, as Jan Kaas, which loosely translated from Dutch meant cheesehead. And of course, we ended up adopting it as Yankees. We misheard it and have kept it ever since. But there's also the distinctions, of course, between Massachusetts and Maine, because these were two places that were settled both by the English, but by entirely different groups of English people in the early 1600s. In fact, the initial leadership groups of the two colonies were from polar opposite realms of the English world of the early 17th century. Maine, as those of you who have read the book know, is founded by this eccentric feudal knight, Sir Ferdinando Gorges. And he was sort of a conservative of the early years of the 17th century, which meant that he was still pining for the disappearing medieval traditions of England. Remember, this is the early modern period, right? England is standing on the doorway between the medieval period and the early modern period, and everything's still in flux, and there's still tensions between the old guild system and manorial serfdom and the emerging commercial pressures of liberalizing that, becoming more of what we today would call a capitalist society, and all the strains were starting to happen. Well, Gorges stood very much on the side of tradition, and the king liked that because the king's prerogatives depended on a lot of those traditions. And so, for his services in the religious battles in the European continent, Sir Ferdinando Gorges was given a great gift. He was given a feudal domain that on paper theoretically extended from just north of the Virginia colony all the way through to Newfoundland. Zillions of acres on paper were transferred over to him to what eventually would become the province of Maine. And he, of course, this is in the early 1600s before the Dutch showed up, and he had his choice of anything in all of that territory, and no, he did not pick the strategically valuable island in the mouth of the Hudson River with, trading rights for the Indians working all the way up the Hudson, all the way till you practically got to the Great Lakes and beyond into Iroquois country. And he didn't choose to set up on the strange little peninsula that was extending out into Massachusetts Bay. No, he decided the capital of this whole vast imperial domain of his that would shore up the empire for the good old sort of, J.R.R. Tolkien, Arthurian version of England, with kings and swords and, responsibilities, and kings and serfs and stuff being passed upwards. That the capital of this whole domain would be in York, Maine, which he initially named Georgiana after himself. So that was his great plan, but the problem, it was going to be Anglican and royalist and neo-feudal and shore things up in the old way, and the king thought that was great. And so he had a domain of his own, not even subject to English Parliament, just to the crown. And his plans were to build this extensive empire, but the problem was that he never ended up leaving England. He kept sending, servants and subordinates to cross the pond and govern in his stead. And so he never really had a really good grip on what conditions were like here in 1615 or 1620. And he sent at one point, his nephew, who newly graduated from college, to go be his lieutenant governor in his stead. And the poor kid gets off the boat expecting, from the way Sir Ferdinando Gorges talked, to find a grand cathedral city surrounded by walls with streets paved with gold and castles and such. And his letters have survived. The letters of Thomas Gorges, and many of them are back to his uncle. The letters say things like, Uncle, your manor house resembles very much your barn at home. And he's documented the things in the manor house at Point Christian. It's like, a rock and a board and a stone. In fact, the entire settlement turns out not to be a cathedral city, but rather this little collection of fishermen and subsistence farmers being eaten by mosquitoes, and while the wolves are surrounding the settlement on the outside. Things are not as they appear, Uncle, you know. Put the letter in the FedEx pack, hand it to the boat, wait 8 weeks for the boat to cross the Atlantic, wait for your uncle to write you a reply and for another boat to be ready, another 8 weeks. I mean, months would pass before he got them to open his FedEx return envelope, which said, build more cities, hire a new bishop, turn out the new guard. So, there was a real disconnect between what Sir Ferdinand Gorges thought was possible on paper and what the conditions were really like in Maine. And so one of the results of this is that his empire didn't really go anywhere. And so by the 1630s, remember he started work on this. He was, involved in the Popham colony. He was involved in the initial fishing settlements at places like Damariscotta and Monhegan. Damariscotta, both of them predating the Pilgrims' arrival at Plymouth Rock, and those were all efforts by Sir Ferdinand Gorges to find a way to earn money to underwrite this whole project of his. But it kept failing. He blew through all of his fortune trying to do this, and then he blew through his wife's fortune, and then his wife died, he married again, he blew through his second wife's fortune, and his second wife died. He blew through a lot of fortunes, and by the 1630s, having blown through all these fortunes, he had only 700 people settled in his vast domain from Newfoundland to Virginia. And the vast majority of those were the Pilgrims who landed at the Plymouth colony simply because they'd gotten scared of shoals and ended up in the wrong place. They were supposed to end up south in the Virginia colony and instead ended up in his turf. In fact, they retroactively had to send somebody home to gain permission for their trespass, which is why they named it Plymouth, because Sir Ferdinand Gorges was the commander of the fort in Plymouth, England at the time. It was homage to him. Well, you had that settlement, and it was having a great deal of trouble. And then, unbeknownst to the king, something happened that they weren't expecting, and that was that as they were trying to get more and more settlers to show up in their American colonies north of Virginia, they started issuing land patents without really doing due diligence. They were really in a hurry, trying to get people out on the land and handing things out. And they got tricked by somebody who was acting as a front, basically, for their worst enemies. Now, the people who settled Massachusetts were the ones who were behind that front operation. And those were the king's worst enemies in the coming conflict in England. And those were the people who had been on the side of the English Civil War was brewing. It was going to break out in the 1640s. And on one side you had the king and the royalists, and on the other side you had the sort of forces that were trying to establish commerce and break down the guild structure and modernize things, something like the Dutch were. The parts of England, in fact, that were closest on the English Channel, just across from the Netherlands, and had been influenced by Calvinism from the Netherlands and a lot of those other factors. The parts of England and Suffolk and Norfolk and the south east of the country where they had the most freehold landholders and factory owners and the sort of initial workings of capitalism, and with it came Calvinism and Puritanism. And a lot of those forces were brewing. Well, there are some that were so committed to this particular Calvinist ethic, they could not broker the compromises that were needed in England, where there were people from many religions who weren't agreeing with them. And these were the Puritans who decided that they would leave. They would go to this new land patent they received around Massachusetts Bay, and they would establish their own utopian society where they could recreate it, as per the words of John Calvin, create a new Zion, a city on the hill, light for people to look at in these dark times, a model and more godly society. Very different place than what Sir Ferdinand Gorges had in mind. And, of course, the king and Sir Ferdinando were stunned when they discovered that this had happened, that they made this error and handed this patent out to this front company with all of these undesirable people moving to the colonies. They figured they'd do something about it, they'd outmaneuver them. And the first surprise they got is just how many of them there were. Because remember, I said by the early 1630s, there were only 700 people in Sir Ferdinando Gorges' domain. Well, 1630 is the beginning of the Puritan migration, the great fleets. And within a few years, there were 20,000 of them living in Massachusetts Bay. The errant accidental colony had greatly outstripped the official one. Well, the king and Sir Ferdinando were going to do something about that and call out the army and revoke their patent, except something else surprising happened. The English Civil War finally broke out in 1640 between the Royalists and the Roundheads. And during the course of that war, the king lost his head. And England ended up having its first and only republic in its history, the one with Oliver Cromwell, which had its ups and downs. But for our story, the key thing is that the official colony suddenly had lost its supporters back in England, and the unofficial errant colony in Massachusetts suddenly had the blessings of Cromwell and the new Republican regime in England. And that gave them free hand, and they were much, much larger, and the Maine settlements weren't able to offer much in the way of defense. Because during the English Civil War, all these little towns in southern Maine, Wells and York and Kittery and so on, were basically ships just stopped showing up. There was no more connection back across the Atlantic. A lot of them had to start governing themselves. Some of these little towns drew up their own charters of government and were running themselves as little micro-republics into themselves. That sort of self-reliance started early by necessity because they'd been cut off so completely. Well, you might imagine that having these two camps, arch enemies in a bloody civil war, one of them royalist and founded largely by people from the west country of England that was more traditional and had more large manners, and the other founded by these radical Calvinists and people from a different part of the country with a different religious tradition. You might imagine that these two things couldn't live side by side for that long, and indeed they couldn't, because Massachusetts moved pretty quickly to annex the Maine settlements in the 1650s. Now they did it for geopolitical reasons for sure, but they also did it because of the Puritan world view towards the wilderness and the wild people living within the wilderness. Because you had in Maine and in the west country of England, where many of these people had come from, the settlements were elongated. The settlement model was the west country model of isolated farmsteads, far apart from one another, extending up and down the rivers, because there weren't really any roads then. And so they were extremely dispersed and extremely difficult to defend. The Puritan settlements were modeled to be clustered villages, because each town, their duty was to keep everyone on the right path. So you wanted to make sure that if the rule was that you're supposed to wash your car on Wednesdays, that everybody does, and if you don't, that your neighbors are going to come out and remind you. And that's very good to keep everyone on the path, everyone doing well, but you have everyone in the little village, and the fields are beyond. People have to go work in the fields, but hey, when the crops grow tall, it's a little bit harder to see the people in the fields. Maybe they're up to no good. There's temptation out there in those fields, especially come fall. And you get out there into the woods beyond. Oh my, nobody can see you in the woods. And there's all kinds of dreadful things in that forest. All those Native American people, all those Indians, they haven't been showing up at the meeting hall as they're supposed to for the Sabbath. What's going on? I think they're in league with the Dark One. That became the forces of temptation. And so people who hung out in the woods too much were suspect. They might be a witch. Maybe you should burn them. And the people who lived in the woods were very much suspect. And as you work into the 17th century, you start seeing a lot of the Puritan divines and leading figures starting to write things about the eastern territories, i.e. Maine, where it's not that the Maine settlers were more higher moral and ethical principles and all that. It was because they weren't led there on those same religious traditions. They were just trying to make a buck for this crazy feudal lord. So they're working, trying to trade. The only real game in town was trading stuff with the Wabanaki people in the river valleys they were in for furs, especially beaver furs, which were incredibly valuable back at home. That was the real money you could make, and they had to have good relations with the Indians to do that. And they could cure the beaver furs and send them back by the boatload, and they didn't rot or anything. It was a perfect cargo, but it required good relations. That was viewed in Massachusetts as, the people of the Eastern Territories are resembling too much the people they ought to replace. And some of the Puritan divines were even talking about how they needed to ethnically cleanse a third of the Indians, wipe out a third, and convert a third to Christianity and make them into proper New Englanders. And so, unfortunately, in the aftermath of the 1650s, things started going awry. And that's why, in the 1650s, Massachusetts moved and formally annexed the Maine settlements one after the other. They sent commissioners, and the commissioners were backed by groups of soldiers. They go into town, again, the records have survived. They go into town and say, "We would like you to join the Commonwealth of Massachusetts," and vote as a town to do so. And there'd be a vote, hear ye, and basically the record shows that everybody in town votes no. That's the last thing we want to do. The governor of the town, Kittery or York, steps out there, who's appointed when they had to form their own compact of government, goes forward and says, "This will be the worst thing ever," and here are all the reasons why. Hear ye, we'd like you to vote again. There's another vote. Some of these votes went on for weeks. And but by the end of it, there'd be this sort of near unanimous vote in the other direction, usually with the governor of the little town, writing out his signature in a shaky hand. So there was sort of a coerced and forced annexation of those settlements. Probably had to happen, right? Because Sir Ferdinand of Gorges was terrible at government. And many of the things that we have in Maine today are New England traditions which extend from that greater New England cultural space that started with the Puritans in Boston and extended through to the annexations of Plymouth and New Hampshire and the sister colony in Connecticut. A lot of those things, the town greens and the town meeting form of government and home rule and all of those things are very much a part of our ethos here in Maine. So what's the problem? Why would there be any animosity going on? Well, there's a lot of animosity. And there's that Life of Brian, with Monty Python. You ever watch that? The movie, John Cleese is out there playing the role of the leader of the Palestinians, and they're going to rise up against the Romans or Jerusalem. And he's saying, what have the Romans ever done for us? There's sort of silence, and Eric Idle, dressed as a woman or something, steps up in the audience and says, well, there is sanitation. Okay, beyond sanitation, roads. Okay, beyond sanitation, pretty soon they have this long list of sewage and laws, and it goes on, and besides, blah, 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 blah. What have they ever done for us? And everyone goes, nothing, and then they go on. It's sort of like that with Massachusetts. What's the problem? You got your entire cultural ethos, Well, the problem was there were two things that ended up having lasting resentments in Maine that can still be felt today within the culture towards all things Massachusettsian. It's strange, you wouldn't expect it, right? And one of them was, two of the key elements came out of the colonial period. And one of them was because of Massachusetts' position on the Indians in the aftermath of the annexations, they launched a series of genocidal Indian wars to wipe out and subjugate the Native American tribes around them. And the Maine settlers ended up suffering the most of the European colonizers in those wars because, as I said, you had those indefensible settlements, and Maine was the frontier. And it was also an area where, despite the epidemics of the early 17th century, when 90% of the Native Americans died from diseases passed on by the Europeans, despite that, in Maine, Native Americans still were a numerical majority, and the settlements were almost impossible to defend. So when the Indian Wars broke out, and it was one after another, 7, if I remember right, over the course of a single century between the 1670s and the 1760s. And in each one of these wars, many of the Maine settlements were wiped out. In the first one, every single settlement east of Wells in York County was wiped out. And all the people, in the mid-coast and communities like this in Georgetown and elsewhere, you ran and jumped into your boats and tried to escape and get out to Damariscotta or Mohegan, which became clogged with refugees waiting for a ship to transplant them to Boston. And in fact, shifted, in Boston in those years that century to be constantly talking about the refugees from Eastern territories. It was such a demographic shift and so enormous that a lot of scholars think that it played into the Salem witch trials and a lot of the tensions. Many of the people accused were people who had arrived as refugees from the outside, from these other territories, including, by the way, the senior cleric from Portland who ended up there and was charged as being a witch in Salem subsequently thereafter. And Maine was essentially a killing field. And even if you survived one of those wars and you got away, and peace finally came after a number of years, and you go back to mid-coast Maine somewhere, and you clear all the trees that have grown out over the past 8 or 9 years, and finally plant crops and stuff, and finally get them going after a few years, and finally getting your orchard tended, and you survive long enough that you're not having to rely on the clam flats during the winter when you run out of food, and finally you get to that point, and then another Indian war breaks out, and you run for your lives, and if you survive, you get to the boat. This went on for 80 years. 90 years, So Maine settlements didn't grow. They were barely surviving. And that's one of the reasons that when you look out over the eastern seaboard of the United States and you wonder, all the way up until the 1990s and in some ways today, how could it be that there's all of this, almost unsettled wilderness land along the seashore on the eastern seaboard? You go far south of here and it's skyscrapers and condos chock-a-block on almost every bit of privately owned seashore. How could that be? How is Maine that much less developed and therefore have so much scenic and natural beauty right on the seaboard? And the reason is that for almost a century, Maine wasn't developing while much of the rest of the seaboard was. There's a second reason, though, for a lot of the resentments that formed between Maine and Massachusetts that comes out of this time period, and that's that as these wars were finally winding down in the 1730s and 1740s and 1750s, and it seemed like there might foreseeably be an end to it all, a bunch of the most powerful people back in Boston and most powerful figures in the Commonwealth started realizing that all of this undeveloped land in mid-coast and eastern Maine along the seaboard was suddenly become incredibly valuable to whoever owned it. And they should look around and say, well, who should own it? Well, I've got a great idea. Come down to the bar. I'll give you 2 million acres of the Maine coast. Hand it off. Oh, I'll give you 3 million acres of the Maine coast. Because the people who were handing these documents around were the governor of Massachusetts, and the former governor of Massachusetts, and the guy who's going to be governor of Massachusetts, and the Speaker of the Massachusetts House. And they ended up installing many of the people, the judges in a lot of the courts, and were assembling on paper these massive land empires to establish themselves as proper aristocrats in the colonial tradition. And their names are no mystery because they tended to name the towns and counties after themselves. So you have the families of Knox and Waldo and Gardner and Hollowell and Vassal and Bowdoin. These are all the great land barons who were forming up these things as the Indian Wars were winding down. And the plan was they would, this land would be so incredibly valuable because during all of these Indian Wars for a century, remember this is a time in the colonial period when the basic family strategy, almost everyone were farmers, and the basic family strategy was, you had a lot of kids, maybe you have 6 or 7 children, and one of them's going to inherit the farm, and the rest are going to disperse to the frontier where new towns are being created and claim land there. And then the grandchildren will go to the next set of settlements 20 years later as the frontier expands. Except that during these Indian Wars throughout New England, and indeed in similar Indian Wars in much of the other parts of the eastern seaboard, it was impossible to go to the frontier because it was a war zone. So you had all in Massachusetts and Connecticut and elsewhere, you had all of this pent-up land hunger because the frontier hadn't expanded even though the population had. And the people who were on the bottom and most desperate would do anything to get to land during times of peace. In fact, in between all these wars, in addition to people returning to places like the mid-coast to claim land, you ended up having people with no particular claim heading here. This was the best place to come to if you were a landless person elsewhere in southern New England. Why? Because remember, there's no real functional roads yet. The cheapest and easiest and safest way to get to the frontier is to jump into a boat in Boston and sail downwind to the east and get off at one of these little settlements in places like Bristol and Damariscotta and Pembroke and Booth Bay, and walk to the edge of the last farm and cut yourself out your own farm, right? And so a lot of people were doing that. And this was frustrating the plans of the land barons I mentioned earlier, who had all this land on paper. And they started sending surveyors around and such after the wars, and as a lot of the wars were closing, going up to people and saying, well, you don't actually own this land. This is owned by, Mr. Knox or Mr. Waldo, and he would like you to pay for it, and you also owe him 43 years of back rent. And the people did not react well to this in the backcountry around here in the mid-coast, because they felt they had a perfect title to the land. Because you ever asked yourself, what is property? Well, a lot of people back then, in the early and mid-18th century, when they asked themselves that question, they went back to sort of, John Locke and a lot of theories about where government and such came from, and they just sort of went to well, there's Genesis, and there'd be light, trees, and wind, blah, 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 blah. And then we had creation there. I guess the first person who wandered out into creation and started making use of it, started putting it to use as a farm or whatever, I guess at that moment they created the first property. Yeah, that's newly minted property, and once you've done that, then you by natural right can then keep it yourself or sell it or pass it on to your heirs. Yeah, that makes sense, that makes sense. That was a widespread set of ideas. And to the settlers showing up in these mid-coast and later eastern Maine settlements, this seemed like exactly what was going on, because they didn't recognize the Native Americans claimed the land, or tended to try to not notice the fact that they were growing maize on the land, that they had all these complicated villages they shifted around between. They saw it as open wilderness land, and that they, by natural right, had a God-given right to use it. Now that they cut down the trees, who are you, surveyor of General Knox, to show up here and tell me that I owe you money? And the fact that many of them were Scots-Irish settlers who'd come from the battlefields of Ulster and the lowlands of England generations before and formed a powerful warrior culture infused with an ethic of individual liberty and a disrespect for inherited status and a sense that you had to defend your kith and kin yourself. Many of these Scots-Irish settlers probably would tar and feather the surveyor and send him on his way. And in fact, as things got more and more tense, there ended up being the second big problem of the period of Massachusetts colonization, which was an armed insurrection by these backcountry settlers throughout the backcountry of Maine, and especially in this area where we are now. An intense fight that ended up to the point where you had a large army, with torches and stuff headed to burn down Montpelier, General Knox's mansion in Thomaston. And the land proprietors, of course, were very powerful people and did their best to try to put this down, but they ended up in that same experience of you can't project power very well into the jungle, especially if everybody out there is against you. And there weren't any roads and there wasn't any infrastructure. And all of the backcountry settlers were united to stop the surveyors. And it ended up that they were starting to exhaust them. And the land proprietors started using more and more extreme techniques until they lost the hearts and minds of their natural allies in Maine and the nice, cozy Federalist seaports of places like Castine, Wiscasset, and Falmouth. Which leads to why Maine ended up having the political coalition that insisted and drove the effort towards statehood, which was finally secured in 1820. So it's all rolled up together, those resentments and those struggles, in the very fact that Maine became a separate polity again. Now, you ever wonder when the good old days were? Remember the good old days? Weren't they good? Yeah, they were awfully good. Well, the good old days in Maine were in the first few decades after statehood in 1820. This was the time when Maine had its most significant influence on the national economy to a degree that will never be again, and its most significant political influence as well. Because this was a time when most of the commerce of the nation was still going north to south, up and down the eastern seaboard in the hulls of wooden sailing vessels. And these wooden sailing vessels tended to be built out of stuff from Maine because we had all of the oak and timber and pine and supplies and pitch that you might need to do that. And because of the long tradition of fishing that went all the way back to Sir Ferdinand O'George's fishing stations, and in mariners' culture, they had all of the skills to do it. So they were tended to be built in Maine, owned by Mainers, and crewed by Mainers. And on top of that, they tend to be sailing around with a whole bunch of stuff from Maine. Because in the early 19th century technological environment, Maine was a storehouse of all the stuff that the rapidly growing cities of the eastern seaboard needed. Things like granite. We got tons and tons of, they were building everything out of granite back then. They were building bridges like the George Washington Bridge. They built the beginning of the Washington Monument out of it, the Philadelphia Post Office, the Pilgrim Monument in Provincetown. They were paving the streets with granite in the form of cobblestones. And where would be the easiest place to get granite, especially at a time when the roads are still crap? Why? In the Maine coast. You go by boat and the Maine coast is nothing but great big slabs of granite. You could just go up to one of these islands because the bathymetry falls off so quickly. You can put your barge, tie it up against the island, put a quarry on the top of it, get a bunch of skilled stonemasons in, and you can quarry all the blocks you need, and you can carve your Corinthian columns and load them right on the barge and take them on down to the construction site, wherever it is, up the Delaware River, at the Hudson, or the Potomac. And that's what happened. It was a huge industry. There was ice. Well, leave it to resourceful New Englanders to, make lemonade out of lemons. You're in this difficult environment. They started selling ice to the world because at that time period before refrigeration, the only way that you could keep things cold and stop meats from perishing and stuff was to have an ice house, to fill it with ice. And they started developing ways to put them underground in tropical environments, pack them with sawdust and ship them, where you could keep the ice for quite a long time. But the problem was it rarely, if ever, froze there. So where are you going to make the ice? You need somewhere that's very cold, has a lot of abundant water that's easily accessible to seagoing fleets, and where the water is very clean. And there was Maine, this crazy shoreline that goes like this, with all these estuaries extending on up like the Damariscotta River does into Damariscotta Lake, and you can get a seagoing vessel all the way up to fresh water. So you could just in the dead of winter carve your ice blocks and float them right down to the ship and load them up and send them off to New Orleans or Charleston or Barbados or wherever it was that they needed ice because it wasn't cold enough there. Started an enormous industry surrounded like that. There was salt cod because Well, going back again to the fishing stations of Sir Ferdinando Gorges, this was the one protein source that the working classes of the early 19th century could afford and access. And so it was distributed all over the place, and also to the slaves of the slave plantations of the American South and of the British and French Caribbean. It was an enormous industry. But then the Golden Age ended, really promptly, in the 3 days after the US Civil War. Just collapsed in the 1860s. And it collapsed because all of the bases of this industrial economy fell apart simultaneously, because somebody invented cement. Hey, you don't need to have any of this granite anymore. And somebody invented artificial refrigeration at a big wholesale scale, so you didn't need to go find somebody to get your ice supply. And people in the big cities started realizing, you know what? Fresh fish really does taste better than salted fish. And that was a big problem for Maine, because it may be downwind to the east to get to Maine and the mid-coast and the fisheries, but if you've got a load of fish in your sailboat, it's tacking all the way back upwind to Boston or New York to offload the fish, and by the time you get there, sometimes the fresh fish is no longer fresh. So the fishing industry ended up moving to ports closer to market, like, Bedford and such. So all those industries collapsed, and then shipping started going on to not on wooden sailing vessels, but into steel-hulled steam vessels that were made in Baltimore and London. But the real thing that drove it, that really caused Maine to collapse into a backwater economy, into a forgotten extension of the country rather than a central piece of it, was that commerce was no longer moving north to south, up and down the eastern seaboard. After the Civil War, it was increasingly moving east to west on the newly expanded railroads. And that did two things. First, the railroads allowed people in what had previously been impossibly distant places to compete with Maine for access to Boston and New York and other major markets, especially for foodstuffs, because despite our maritime heritage, most people in Maine were farmers. And suddenly, they found themselves competing with farmers in Ohio who actually had topsoil. And the Ohioans could sometimes now get their stuff to market faster than the Mainers, because the railroads were not coming in this direction very quickly at all. They got up a little ways into southern Maine, and then they started encountering the railroad economists, all this crazy undulating shoreline that had been such an advantage throughout our history until then, was a nightmare for the economics of rail building. You had the state with no real population centers, and lots of, especially on the coast, lots of tiny dispersed settlements separated from one another by deep estuaries and fjord-like depths. So every 500 feet, you're having to build a new expensive bridge just to get to some measly town of 70 people. The railroad did not want to do it, and the railroads came very slowly up the coastline. This is where the story of the coast of Maine, which is the story of Lobster Coast, and the story of the interior starts splitting, because the interior is getting settled now, and the interior has a little bit different story, because there was industry there that was starting to be connected, but Maine's coast was starting to fall into a backwater status. And it did enter, and became this backwater, and the economy collapsed after the Civil War, and entered a profound depression that most of the state is still not recovered from. It's a 150-year-long depression. And it leaves a mark on people to be depressed that long. Mainers are resilient, and we're independent, and we're hardworking, and we're, self-motivated, and we improvise, and we're self-sufficient. It's because we had to, right? Because nobody's going to give you a job. You got to come up with it yourself. And the statistics, it's quite amazing. I mean, you go back and look, the federal government kept statistics on per capita income by state adjusted for the cost of living, because we spend so much of our resources each year, just trying to keep warm in the winter. And Maine would consistently, all the way up into the early 1980s, finish 50th of the states. Or 49th or 48th, but duking it out with Mississippi and Louisiana for being the poorest place in the entire country. And that had an important demographic implication, which I'll tell you in a second. And that was this, that there wasn't an incentive for immigrants, particularly in the great immigration waves that followed the Civil War in the late 19th and early 20th century. There wasn't really an incentive to come to Maine, because Maine was de-industrializing during this period. People were leaving Maine in droves. All the coastal counties were actually losing population. You had abandoned farmhouses out there. You had the Ohio fever, where people were just getting on any means of transportation they could to go to that fabled topsoil, go somewhere where they could actually grow things and have good infrastructure connections. And the result of that was that with very few people coming into the coastal communities during those immigration waves, to a great extent, all the way up and through the late 1980s, and in some places and in some extent still today, the same families and people who originally colonized these places in the 1630s or the 1730s or the 1770s, depending where you are on the east-west arc of settlement up the coast. People who first settled these communities and got the first oil grants or whatever it was were often still there. You could go around Booth Bay in the 1980s and to some extent still today, and many other communities around here, and you could match up the map from the 1730s of the King's Royal Grants with the mailboxes. Not only are they still in town, they're still on the same land. Barter's Island, Barters. There's not a lot of places that have that kind of rootedness. And from the sort of accidental tragedy of the economy, you ended up with something rather unusual in American and North American history, shared perhaps only by the Quebecois, which was that you had a group of people who remained sort of in place without that many other people coming in for a very long period of time, because Maine was settled very early, and then had that experience of having the economic catastrophe for a long period where other people weren't really coming in large numbers. And so you had that imagined European sense of people in the land, the sense that events that happened 200 years ago happened to my family and we were here for them and stuff. That European sense of what I call in the book almost nationhood. And if you start thinking about sort of the native Maine identity as being sort of a nation that's been colonized and stuff, a lot of the strange attitudes and pathologies that we Mainers have start making a lot more sense. The people who come from away and say, they treat us like we're foreigners. Yes, you're onto something there. And the irony is that it was at this time period when the coast of Maine was deindustrializing and going through this tragic collapse, that the outside world first discovered the pleasures of the Maine summer. Because really people didn't have vacations and didn't travel around in summer that much until after the Civil War. And many of the first summer people who came to settlements, like Mount Desert Island and Booth Bay and elsewhere, were coming because they'd seen the paintings of some of those great, early and mid-19th century romantic painters, the Frederick Churches and Charles Codman's, giant canvas the size of this curtain here, and there's Mount Desert's rock, with sunset and sea battering it, and people went, oh my gosh, look at that landscape, that's absolutely incredible, it's so beautiful, we ought to go there. And yeah, so lots of people in the salons of Philadelphia and New York and Boston and elsewhere did go. And they came and arrived and they were stunned by what they saw. It was absolutely incredible. And they were the ones with the time off, so the first people who came were either college professors who had time off in the 19th century, or the Gilded Age plutocratic families at the height of the Gilded Age. And they were all arriving and looking around, and they couldn't believe what they saw sociologically, too. They looked around, they saw not a collapsing economy and devastation and a depressed people having to be self-sufficient, whether they liked it or not. They thought they'd found Eden. How could that be? How could they have that disconnect? Well, it's because of where they were coming from and the times that they were coming. Because, remember, this is now the late 19th century. It's getting into the era of early industrialization of the dirtiest and nastiest sort, that Dickens would have written about. Factories spewing out stuff, and there's no air protection measures of any kind, and everyone's still hauling things around with horses, and nobody's cleaning up behind them, and people are dumping their chamber pots out in the street, and it's all just a stinky, nasty mess, particularly come summer, when diseases start breaking out. They'll wipe off the soot from the windows every 5 minutes and stuff, and anybody with the means and any sensibility would get out of town for their health. They would go out to spas and stuff, but they were literally worried about their health. So the wealthy classes would try to get away. And they were not only trying to get away from the sounds and smells, but they were very concerned about the people and the character of the cities. Because with industrialization, and many of these people actually owned the industries and the factories, all sorts of people were arriving from Europe and elsewhere, all sorts of immigrants to take jobs at these places. Immigrants with strange customs and peculiar clothing and languages nobody's even heard of before, like French. And Gaelic and Italian, and what is going on? What has happened to the good old taciturn Anglo-Protestant golden age world that we all remember when we were kids, they would say. Ah, yeah, those were good old days. Yeah, I remember those good old days. We were Anglo and Protestant and taciturn, and we'd go to the town meeting and we'd be Anglo and Protestant. Yes, good times. And then we'd go over to the meeting house and we'd spend the Sabbath being Anglo and Protestant and taciturn. That's darn right, darn right. People should be like that again. But it's not there anymore. What's going on? It's a shame. Everything's been destroyed. The great East Coast cities are becoming madness and chaos. And if we could only get our bearings and find somewhere that really held on to the past, we'd go there, we'd build great ramshackle houses, we'd leave our cars at home, we'd rusticate to the rustic eras, we'd teach the kids to sail. Good idea, good idea. We need some people to do that. And to mow the lawns, that too. It'd be like the way life should be. It would be perfect. If only there was such a place protected from all of that corruption. Some place that was Anglo and Protestant and taciturn. And then they got off the boat in Bar Harbor, Youth Bay, and there they were. Taciturn, Anglo-Protestant people getting more taciturn by the day. It was perfect. And so was born the myth of, Maine, the way life should be. As you can see, there's a lot of parallels with today. That began early, and it ended up with a strange disconnect between the experiences of many of the families that had been there for a very long time and those who were arriving, pursuing this dream of escape from the problems of the great megalopolis to the south. And that could be boiled down to, they would literally see different things. You could go to a town, and it'd be a farmhouse up on the hillside, and it's all weather beaten, and nobody seems to live there anymore, and all the paint's peeled off nicely, and it's got that nice gray look, and the field is all overgrown with beautiful wildflowers. And, the rusticators would come and say, that's just absolutely beautiful. It's so Wyeth-esque. Let's sit down and paint that. And the guy down the road says, it's the Jones farm. It failed. Mr. Jones hung himself. The kids went to Ohio. So looking on the same feature of the land, right? Transcendent romantic era beauty and terrible human catastrophe and depression. Both seen, both attached to the same object. Both for legitimate reasons, but for completely different perspectives. And that, unfortunately, to some extent, has still been with us today at a municipal level up and down the coast. That sort of classic divide, which can be shorthanded to the sort of native, multi-generational people and those arriving from away. And it plays out in municipal politics and virtually everything. Should we build an LNG terminal in Harpswell or in our outside Perry, or should we have a new super Walmart in Damariscotta or outside Auckland or in Bangor? Should we widen US Route 1 in Camden? Should we have a national park in the northern woods? It all boils down often into that same divide. And it's a pity because the two groups actually both feel passionately civically engaged and passionate about Maine and its future and the future of their towns, but they're seeing it in two different directions. So sort of lampooning of it would be that native, perception and experience leads one to say, yeah, build, 7 lanes of highway straight to Rockland, pave over the bay, put an oil refinery there, add an LNG terminal, 6 lanes of airport, dredge the channel, maybe a job will show up. You want to fall off of the truck on the way to New Brunswick? I don't know, but we need jobs. Why? Because we've been here for 12 generations and my kids and grandkids are going away because there are no jobs here for them. There's nothing in the whole fabric of the community going back 12 generations, the traditions and ethic and ethos that built the kind of community that attracted all the rest of you to come here is going to disappear. And it's a legitimate perspective. But then on the other side, you have the perspective of, no, there should be no industry and nothing built at all there. We should have it all be a national park and be all absolutely beautiful and pristine, and everybody should telecommute to their jobs that they left behind in San Francisco and Manhattan, like I do. We should have our, our organic cashew flown in, and everything will be fine. Don't go messing around with that lobster plant. And why are you starting up your diesel engine so you know it's 5 in the morning? We just had a lovely party in our summer house, and we live right on the water. We can hear that. Oh, so what are you putting in those lobster traps? We need to have an ordinance against that. From now on, nobody is going to start a diesel engine in the harbor until 10:30, like normal people. And no more of that stinky bait on the dock. Take that home. And then that kind of stuff actually did happen. There have been towns where those kind of ordinances were passed. When people from the outside, you can kind of really understand how the lobster fishery works, would do that. Or you had people, were sitting out there in the house they just built in the woods by the bay, and then suddenly a bunch of Freddy Krueger-like people with, flannel shirts carrying these warlike implements start marching through a path in their yard. They freak out and call the police. Arrest these people. They're going to kill me. No, it's a bunch of, clam diggers who follow the path they've gone for 12 generations, but the previous guys were cool with it, but suddenly there's a new owner who doesn't know what they are and what they're doing out there. And it's that kind of disconnect that unfortunately has fueled all kinds of discontent in a lot of communities. And I'm happy that, the whole goal of Lobster Coast was to kind of bridge that, because both perspectives are legitimate ones, they're just half of the actual truth. Because the perspective of a lot of outsiders coming in are, they see that they come from Loudoun County, Virginia, or from Cape Cod, where they know that when development comes, it can come over you like a steamroller before your town can even get its bearings. And if you don't sort of plan ahead for some of those things and decide what kind of community you want to be and do land use planning, you're not going to plan anything. It's going to be planned for you from the outside. And so, they come in with a rather legitimate perspective, but also lost in that is the understanding of all of these, the ways these communities have functioned and the valuable things that they produced and how they exist. And you can do both, We can actually build we can sustain this sort of valuable treasure, because, there's not going to be any more wild, untouched places in the world. There's going to be less and less of them. You just read a couple weeks ago in the Lewiston paper how a group in China is now investing in one of the old shoe factories to make it into a luxury residence for Chinese medical tourists to go to Central Maine Medical Center for procedures, because they're so stunned by the beauty and the cleanness of the air and water in Lewiston, Auburn. Wait till they see Grand Lake Stream. That gives you a sense of the perspective if you're coming from Beijing or Shanghai, where the pollution is so total. This actually is an incredible asset that we have. And we know it. It's going to be one that has increasing value. But we also need to be able to do it in such a way where there actually is economy and jobs and a vibrant economy where, you don't have to have the connections and the telecommute from San Francisco before you arrive in the communities. And we can do both. And that's been the argument of Lobster Coast, to try to bring the perspectives together. And I'm happy to say, the book came out now 11 years ago. So we're starting to get some time. And I've been happy. My sense has been that there actually has been a lot of progress in that way in a lot of communities in Maine. That the divides that 10, 15 years ago you would see in some towns are starting to be bridged. Never the twain shall meet. This community organization is always run by the people from away, and it would never even occur to them to have board members from the families that have been there for a zillion generations, and vice versa. You're seeing a lot more crossover in a lot of communities, which I find very encouraging, and some of those walls are starting to break down. But the pressures that maybe 10, 15 years ago I was writing about in the mid-coast, I think have sort of spread out eastward. Eastern Hancock and Washington County are as to Lincoln County 20 years ago, and so on and so forth. Well, I'm going to stop there and open it up for questions for all of you, because you've read this book and probably already knew all this stuff I just said. You may ask a question. I can see you all now. Well, who wants to be first? Raise your hand. Don't be shy. Yes, please.
If you were writing the book now, which theme or idea or subject would change the most from when you wrote the book originally?
That's a good question. I think that if I were to update it, it's that some of those divides, just like I said just a moment ago, that some of those divides have lessened, because I think some of the lessons I was hoping to push out into the culture through Lobster Coast, I think are being internalized in different places. And so some of that is encouraging. I would say that the struggle in many communities that 12, 15 years ago when I was researching the book was still very alive between the sort of multi-generational people and those from away. Those from away have, won the demographic war and, sort of ended up in a position of power. And so the dynamic has become on much of the coast much more about educating new arrivals as to what they've walked into, because, the power tends to lie there. And, but I've been encouraged that that's been somewhat successful. So I think if I was writing the book afresh now, it would be a bit different because some of those things have evolved. But the things I was talking about for, Booth Bay and Lincoln County are probably very much true right now in, Machiasport and Steuben and Lubec. So it's just true of a different part of the coast. So I guess the update would be looking at some of that. And there are other issues out there, of course, as well, but those are a couple that I would lock onto. Yes, please.
The part of the Maine Constitution that has not been allowed to be published that seems to bear greatly on Native American rights. How do you see that, if I could call them the third nation, that conspicuously didn't mention in your talk?
Yeah, because there's only so much we can say in 40 minutes, but as you know from Lobster Coast, it very much gets into the Native American legacy, and you're probably a reader of Unsettled. I did a series in the Press Herald Maine Sunday Telegram that ran sequentially for 29 straight days, page 1. That was a continuous narrative of the Passamaquoddy people of the past 50 years, which is a tragic story for those who've read it. I mean, in many ways, and it's the story of many colonial people have experienced of a struggle against an oppressive imperial power, and once the struggle is won, then oftentimes the internal despots end up rising up and you have a second tragedy. And there's that next phase of kind of completing all that internally. So that's still going on as well. But one of the things that was exposed in Unsettled and has since been kicked around a little bit in Maine's policy circles is one of the symbolic things was that at one point in the 1870s, I think, the articles of the Maine Constitution that pertain to the state's responsibilities to the Indian tribes, there was a referendum passed and a constitutional amendment that article, while remaining in effect, could no longer be printed. And so it was sort of officially redacted even though it was in effect in the Constitution. The whole article, if you read the whole thing, there are some things that were no longer relevant, one-shot things about how Maine was going to separate from Massachusetts and become a new state. This is the 1820 Constitution. So there's a whole articles of separation passed in Massachusetts, which controlled Maine about how that would work. But one of the things was Maine had to, within its own constitution, written right into it in this particular article, had to uphold all of the treaty responsibilities that Massachusetts had bound itself to, the Passamaquoddy and Penobscot. And in the 1870s, these were very much alive, right up until the 1980 land claim settlement. They were very much alive, and Maine was terribly cheating on them, including the raiding of a trust fund that in 1967 would have been worth about $180 million, I think I remember. Some very large amount just for the Passamaquoddy, who then numbered, I think, 1,200 officially on the reservations. So, I mean, it was and lots of land taken and stuff. So it was symbolically, the fact that document, although I believe legally it's no longer in effect because those treaties, I believe, have been set aside by the Settlement Act, for better or worse, but symbolically, the fact that it's still redacted from the Constitution, that we still have this language that says, this part remains in force, but we won't print it, I think is, symbolically unsatisfactory, and certainly is to the tribes. But some of the tribes make an argument that there are treaties that somehow are still being missed. My reading, I mean, I'm not a lawyer, but my reading of it is, I think the Settlement Act has some pretty strong language that sort of stamped out all pre-existing treaties, but symbolically it's still, unsettling. Yes, please.
Given the quality of life here and the legendary Maine work ethic, what do you see as the barriers to the solution to the lack of jobs and the weak economy for alternate energy development, whether it be wind, solar, or tidal?
Specifically for energy development?
Pardon me?
You mean specifically for energy or just the whole?
Well, it seems this would be the Silicon Valley of that kind of development, given that people would want to live here and develop that.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think we fell into a backwater in that 1860s period because we were in the middle of nowhere, right? You know, nobody wanted to build the railways through all of those bridges, and if you did, what are you on your way to? You know, New Brunswick? Nobody even knew what New Brunswick was. I think that's where Rutgers is, right? So there was no way, you know, so we ended up at the end of the line, right? Kind of off to the, you know, east and north of the whole rest of the country. You know, the only state that only borders on one other state. Not on the way to anything either. So to be rural and not on the way to anything at a time when transportation and, you know, communications and commerce were very tightly linked, I think was a big problem. And I think we've internalized a lot of that sort of, you know, second-rate feeling, you know, status, this sense that we're, you know, that legitimate things and, you know, people doing great things come from elsewhere. And I think that's really unfortunate, you know, that's sort of been ingrained into the way we think about stuff and the possibilities. There's a sort of notion that things aren't possible here. Well, you could do that, but the snow would knock it down, you know. I've seen it before, you know. There's a lot of that. So some of it is that sort of a level of defeatism earned through generations of bleak experience that we need to somehow get around. And the second is, I think the realization is only starting to dawn now that we're no longer a backwater because the world's changed and you don't need to be in the center of things to participate the same way. You know, communications and the internet and everything else have made it possible to do things from here that many of you probably do that you couldn't have done from Maine before. And just, you know, you need key pieces of infrastructure to kind of allow that to happen. But in the globalized world, we have a lot of assets, you know, like how the Chinese look upon the possibility of coming here, even if it's Lewiston, Auburn, you know, it's an incredible place that would come to get medical care because, you know, it's so much better than Shanghai or Beijing's air. You start seeing it in a different way. So it's kind of, I think part of it is that sort of deep way, that psychology of grasping onto those things. As far as the energy projects, I mean, yeah, part of it is that sort of, you know, we don't have that can-do, you know, spirit on big projects, right? When things get bigger than sort of individual entrepreneur level, they start seeming somehow unwieldy or suspect. I think that that's played some role in it. And the current administration in Augusta is not very keen on wind power, as you know. The big Statoil deal that Norway's going to do with offshore wind was pretty much, you know, sabotaged by the governor's office. So that's obviously a portion of it currently right now. But yeah, those are some of the key obstacles, I think, not just to energy, but to, you know, any big project, you know, reach. It's not like California where it's the, you know, California dream, we can do anything, you know, let's invent an iPad, you know, that kind of spirit in the culture. We've got that obstacle to work around. We should. There's absolutely no reason that we should be considering ourselves second best and all that, and I'm, you know, very much an advocate for changing it, but you do feel it and you run into it. Sometimes when I drive from Bridgeton and Freiburg over to North Conway and you cross the border in New Hampshire, some strange lift, you know, something happened here, you know. North Conway created in the middle of nowhere the whole summer tourist industry, you know, there's tons of stuff going on when it's not ski season, you know, this sort of somebody possibility and people did it kind of thing that this sometimes shocks me when I leave the state after a little while. So I think some of those things are kind of the deeper elements of it. I guess you're pointing there. Somebody's pointing authoritatively. So we'll go this way.
I wanted to ask you where Governor LePage fits into this scenario.
Which scenario are we thinking of? The energy one?
No, just in general, it's very controversial, the views in general, and specifically in Maine.
Well, I mean, Lobster Coast is focused on the coast, and in a sense, it's focused in a fine, you know, fabric way at the level of municipalities and what happens in town government, what happens in each of our towns, and the sociology and, you know, concerns, and, you know, that Massachusetts effect, you know, that if you're driving down the highway and the car cuts you off, and the car happens to have Massachusetts plates, and you're a native Maine, it's like, get this, you know. Something surges up in you that wouldn't if it had been Ohio or Vermont plates. It's all that stuff. So on the other side, no, in my career as a journalist, investigative journalist, I'm dealing with the political environment at the statewide level all the time. It's a little bit different beast. I mean, I can talk about it, but it's not directly linked to the sort of main thrust of Lobster Coast. But, and among other things, a lot of the governor's electoral support has actually not been in the coastal zone, but in the interior, which is the part which is having, a lot of the interior is not having all this dynamic I talked about with sort of people from away and the native community and the struggle between that and all that. The story is often, depopulation and, hopelessness in a lot of communities. I grew up in western Maine, way up in the foothills, and the little towns between Saddleback and Sugarloaf and the other Maine. I go up there's none of that tension because it looks exactly like it did when I was growing up in the 70s and 80s, except that, the wood turning mill was shut down and the lumber yard is shut down, like all the things that people did for jobs are shut down, and they're all commuting to be cashiers at Walmart at the Farmington Shopping Center, so it's an even bleaker environment than it was in terms of your prospects. So I think it's a very different dynamic that if we're going to sort of explore the LePage phenomenon, would take you away from sort of the coastal zone in a lot of ways to sort of understand. And there is that dynamic where there's a very different set of experiences out there in the far rim counties, as they say, than there is in the core counties, which include most of the coast. I'll go here first.
I think in your penultimate chapter, you talked about the national history of the lobster. I'm interested in that, particularly as it affects the working waterfront, which is underdeveloped. I'm sure the right hand of the coast, you see that. You see the people from the way coming, wanting the short term. You see the fishermen having a hard time. And I'm particularly interested in the unshared database that you described between a certain segment of scientific people and the experience of the fishermen. Lobster. And I'm wondering in the last 10 years, what has climate change, warming water, how does that inform that issue?
Yeah, well, two things. I mean, the questions.
What was the question?
Question is both about the divide between the databases, so to speak, of the scientists and the fishermen, and the failure for them, for it to be shared in the past. And the other question being about how climate change fits into the sort of lobster fishery and the fishery and ecosystem and the communities that rely on it. And the first one is just like the other dynamic, has gotten much, much better. The scientific community and the fishing community is cooperating and respecting one another and gathering insights and strengths from each other to a degree that they never have before in history. I mean, maybe it can be improved upon, but the current generation of scientists, people who are my age and younger, are entirely cooperating with fishermen as their platforms and understanding their observations and all those kind of things. So the information is sent back and forth. And I think a lot more of the younger generation of the fishing community are also appreciate certain elements of what the scientists are trying to do and participate in. So there's not the same total level of hostility that would have been in, say, 1965 or something like that. So that's all for the good. The climate change element is, of course, for the bad. As many of you may know, the Gulf of Maine scientists at GMRI are calculating out the trends of the increase in temperature of surface waters in the Gulf of Maine and finding that the Gulf is warming faster than at any time in the past 150 years, and also in the past 10 years faster than 98, anywhere except maybe 1% of other ecosystems on the planet. So an absolutely incredible pace and an enormous absolute change, which is causing all kinds of strange things to happen out there. Perhaps most noticeable, to people living on the shore is the green crab invasion, where you have warm water, particularly in 2012, there's an enormous temperature spike, and green crabs are just crawling all over large parts of especially Casco Bay and the town of Penobscot, up in Penobscot Bay, and just not only eating every single soft shell clam they could find in all the flats of Freeport and Brunswick and elsewhere, but also tearing up all of the eelgrass, which forms the basis of much of the northern Casco Bay ecosystem, where things eat and forage and all that, happening just at a stunning speed that really astonished scientists. And you're seeing all kinds of strange species starting to show up. There are Nova Scotia. There's a green crab invasion at Kedgie National Park around the corner from Yarmouth, and they've been fighting because the green crabs are, in an effort to forage, are tearing up all the eelgrass and they're trying to get at stuff. They just rip it all to pieces. And they don't want the eelgrass to be taken away, so the Parks Canada people have been fighting them, trapping them in huge numbers. And then all of a sudden last year, they started noticing the green crab numbers were going down because Chesapeake blue crabs had started showing up in large numbers and were eating them. So, yeah, Chesapeake blue crabs getting established in Nova Scotia. Black sea bass showing up in people's nets. Talked to a woman, a young lobster woman the other day who was in the Blue Hill Stonington area, was advocating strongly to try to start the first longfin squid commercial fishery in the Gulf of Maine. We didn't used to have longfin squid, now they're starting to show up. And the other concern is that if you look at the thermal requirements of a lot of the species that we rely on, cod and a lot of other things, are at these they're subarctic species at the southern edge of their range in the Gulf of Maine. And the temperatures that we've been having, the temperature forecasts, all potentially reduce their habitat substantially or could extirpate them from the Gulf. So the answer is climate change is changing absolutely everything, and we don't even have enough information to kind of figure out and understand what's going to happen, just that every imaginable lever is being thrown simultaneously. So far, lobsters seem to be pretty resilient to it, but it does make anyone who's sort of connected with the water and the science and watching this a little bit nervous because there's so much change happening so fast. So stay tuned on that.
Pardon me, I hate to interrupt this wonderful time, but Colin has agreed to sign books. It's getting near 8:30, and there are a whole lot of us in here that want to do that. So I'm going to ask if you would forgive me. I'm going to stop the questions right now. Colin is going to be over there at the table. You can come up on the stage and bring your book. And for those of you who do not want to do that, join us out in the vestibule for a little bit of a celebration. And please join me in thanking Colin.